Florence is a city where power was once built of stone. Not of thrones, not of armies, but of walls that stood still for centuries. Amidst these narrow streets, there is a palace that has never fallen, never been seized, and never disappeared. Palazzo Gondi is still there. But what is remarkable is not that it still exists. It is that everything that once made it important is gone. No more ruling family. No more power to decide the fate of the city. Only stone, time, and a quiet question remain: what truly remains when power has departed, but the structure has not? This is not a story of collapse. This is a story of how power disappears without collapsing. In the heart of Florence, once considered the center of power, finance, and intellect of Renaissance Europe, stands a structure that never seeks to overwhelm the viewer with ostentation. The Palazzo Gondi does not occupy the largest square, is not gilded, nor is it associated with lavish festivals or grand coronations. Yet, it is precisely this quiet presence that makes it a unique witness to history, not the history of glorious victories, but the history of the enduring, self-respecting, and ultimately, the silent fading of the Florentine aristocracy. Florence at the end of the 15th century was not a city of tranquility. It was a metropolis strained between currents of power: international trade, banking credit, unstable republican politics, and families constantly vying for influence. In this context, power was not measured by crowns or thrones, but by the ability to control land, money, marriage, and architecture. Each stone palace that rose in the city was a statement not just of wealth, but of a family's enduring position within the Florentine social order. The Gondi family emerged precisely within that space. They were neither rebels nor rulers of the city. Rather, they were the quintessential representatives of the Florentine merchant aristocracy, cautious, discreet, yet ambitious to maintain their status for generations. When they decided to build the Palazzo Gondi at the end of the 15th century, they did not seek to outmaneuver the most powerful families, but to stand firm among them, a strategy clearly reflecting the survival mindset of the Florentine elite. The choice of architect for the Palazzo Gondi was no accident. The building is intrinsically linked to the Florentine Renaissance architectural tradition, deeply influenced by its balanced forms, solid rustication facades, and restrained ornamentation. This is not a building to awe, but a structure designed to endure. Each massive block of stone stacked upon the other carries a clear message: the Gondi family's power is not based on fleeting ostentation, but on stability, order, and continuity. This becomes even more remarkable when considering the Palazzo Gondi in its inseparable relationship with Florence's most powerful family of the time, the Medici family. While the Medici built their influence through international banking, art patronage, and increasingly evident political control, families like the Gondi chose a different path, existing in a buffer zone between cooperation and distance. The Palazzo Gondi, situated not far from the city's center of power, accurately reflects this position, close enough not to be excluded from the political order, but discreet enough not to become a direct target in the fierce power struggles. Within the thick stone walls of Palazzo Gondi, the aristocratic life of Florence unfolded less boisterously than the Renaissance narratives often portray. It was a space of family negotiations, carefully calculated marriages, land deals, and silent alliances. Power here wasn't expressed through public pronouncements, but through patience, adaptability, and the acceptance that not every victory needed to be remembered. However, this very model of cautious power held the seeds of decline. As Florence entered the following centuries, the order upon which the aristocratic families had relied began to crumble. Global trade shifted, power became increasingly concentrated in larger dynasties, and Florence, from an independent financial center, became part of the broader power structure of Italy and Europe. Palaces like Palazzo Gondi didn't collapse, weren't confiscated, or were abandoned immediately. They simply became quieter. That silence is not a sign of immediate death, but the beginning of a process that will last for generations, a process in which power does not disappear, but loses its ability to shape the future. Palazzo Gondi continues to stand, but its role in Florentine life changes. From a symbol of a family asserting its position, it gradually becomes a historical structure, more part of the urban landscape than a vibrant center of power. The next part of the story will delve deeper into that shift as Florence's political, economic, and cultural upheavals gradually erode the foundations upon which the aristocracy had relied for centuries, and how Palazzo Gondi reflects that decline not through tragedy, but through the silent continuation of time. If Palazzo Gondi was once built as a declaration of stability and order, the 16th century opened up a completely different reality for Florence. This was no longer Florence of unwavering faith in the future, but Florence of prolonged upheaval, where old power structures began to reveal undeniable cracks. Noble families, who once believed their stability was self-evident, now faced an unprecedented question: could power exist without changing its form? Florence entered the new century with the vivid memory of successive political upheavals. The Republican model, once the pride of the city, was becoming increasingly fragile under internal and external pressure. Citizens' councils, once representing the balance between the families, now became battlegrounds of short-term compromises and long-term fears. In this context, the Florentine aristocracy did not lose power immediately. Instead, they gradually lost the certainty that their power was permanent. The Gondi family, like many other long-established families, reacted to this shift by withdrawing further into their own private space. The Palazzo Gondi ceased to be a place of public assertion of power, becoming a center of internal governance, where decisions were made within the family, rather than in the political arena. The stone chambers that once echoed with power negotiations were now quieter, as Florence's major decisions were increasingly decided outside the traditional aristocratic walls. The rise of centralized ruling powers, particularly the increasingly evident influence of the Medici family, completely altered the balance of power. What was noteworthy was not the Medici family's hold on power, but how they exercised it. Power no longer relied primarily on consensus among equal families, but shifted to a model of patronage, control, and dependence. In this new order, families like the Gondi were not eliminated, but neither did they hold the role of shaping the city's destiny. They existed in the gray area of history, where influence remained, but not strong enough to forge a new direction. This created a profound paradox. Palazzo Gondi remained physically intact, even meticulously maintained, but its social significance began to slip away from the present. It became a symbol of a recent past, but no longer central to the future. This decline did not occur through property confiscations or political exiles, but through a shift in the way power was exercised, a change subtle enough not to cause a shock, yet profound enough to alter everything. Within the city, the younger generations of Florentine nobility began to confront choices their fathers and grandfathers had never had to consider. They could maintain their family's prestige within the old framework, or adapt to the new order by serving centralized power. Both paths came at a price. Maintaining their status meant a gradual shrinking of influence, while adaptation required abandoning a part of their traditional aristocratic identity, the very thing that had defined them for centuries. Florence, during this period, did not witness a dramatic collapse of the aristocracy. Instead, the city became a space of quiet transition. The stone palaces, including Palazzo Gondi, continued to be present in urban life, but their role shifted from centers of power to architectural memory. People passing by no longer saw vibrant power, but the static stability of stone, a stability no longer capable of controlling destiny. It is in this stillness that the historical tragedy of the Florentine aristocracy gradually unfolds. They were not defeated in a single battle. They were overtaken by time, by more flexible power structures, and by a world expanding beyond Florence's narrow streets. Palazzo Gondi, once a symbol of enduring ambition, became a landmark marking the moment when power began to slip from the hands of the families once believed to be immutable. The next part of the story will delve deeper into the economic and social upheavals that exacerbated this process, as the flow of money, international trade, and a shifting concept of wealth gradually rendered the Florentine aristocratic model obsolete, and Palazzo Gondi became a silent witness to a disintegrating order. If Palazzo Gondi was once built as a declaration of stability and order, the 16th century opened up a completely different reality for Florence. This was no longer Florence of unwavering faith in the future, but Florence of prolonged upheaval, where old power structures began to reveal undeniable cracks. Noble families who once believed their stability was self-evident now faced an unprecedented question: could power exist without changing its form? Florence entered the new century with the vivid memory of successive political upheavals. The Republican model, once the pride of the city, was becoming increasingly fragile under internal and external pressure. Citizens' councils, once representing the balance between the families, now became battlegrounds of short-term compromises and long-term fears. In this context, the Florentine aristocracy did not lose power immediately. Instead, they gradually lost the certainty that their power was permanent. The Gondi family, like many other long-established families, reacted to this shift by withdrawing further into their own private space. The Palazzo Gondi ceased to be a place of public assertion of power, becoming a center of internal governance where decisions were made within the family rather than in the political arena. The stone chambers that once echoed with power negotiations were now quieter, as Florence's major decisions were increasingly decided outside the traditional aristocratic walls. The rise of centralized ruling powers, particularly the increasingly evident influence of the Medici family, completely altered the balance of power. What was noteworthy was not the Medici family's hold on power, but how they exercised it. Power no longer relied primarily on consensus among equal families, but shifted to a model of patronage, control, and dependence. In this new order, families like the Gondi were not eliminated, but neither did they hold the role of shaping the city's destiny. They existed in the gray area of history, where influence remained, but not strong enough to forge a new direction. This created a profound paradox. Palazzo Gondi remained physically intact, even meticulously maintained, but its social significance began to slip away from the present. It became a symbol of a recent past, but no longer central to the future. This decline did not occur through property confiscations or political exiles, but through a shift in the way power was exercised, a change subtle enough not to cause a shock, yet profound enough to alter everything. Within the city, the younger generations of Florentine nobility began to confront choices their fathers and grandfathers had never had to consider. They could maintain their family's prestige within the old framework, or adapt to the new order by serving centralized power. Both paths came at a price. Maintaining their status meant a gradual shrinking of influence, while adaptation required abandoning a part of their traditional aristocratic identity, the very thing that had defined them for centuries. Florence, during this period, did not witness a dramatic collapse of the aristocracy. Instead, the city became a space of quiet transition. The stone palaces, including Palazzo Gondi, continued to be present in urban life, but their role shifted from centers of power to architectural memory. People passing by no longer saw vibrant power, but the static stability of stone, a stability no longer capable of controlling destiny. It is in this stillness that the historical tragedy of the Florentine aristocracy gradually unfolds. They were not defeated in a single battle. They were overtaken by time, by more flexible power structures, and by a world expanding beyond Florence's narrow streets. Palazzo Gondi, once a symbol of enduring ambition, became a landmark marking the moment when power began to slip from the hands of the families once believed to be immutable. The next part of the story will delve deeper into the economic and social upheavals that exacerbated this process as the flow of money, international trade, and a shifting concept of wealth gradually rendered the Florentine aristocratic model obsolete. And Palazzo Gondi became a silent witness to a disintegrating order. As the economic foundation began to slip from the hands of the aristocracy, a more profound change occurred at a different level, far more subtle but enduring: the cultural and social identity level. Florence changed not just because of money or political power, but because of how the city's inhabitants began to see themselves. The values that once defined the aristocracy, family honor, social etiquette, bloodline continuity, and cultural patronage, became out of sync with a faster-moving, more pragmatic, and less patient urban life. For centuries, the Florentine aristocracy existed as a discrete yet recognized class. They didn't need to demonstrate their power daily, for their very way of living, their residences, and their appearances in the urban landscape were sufficient evidence. Palaces like Palazzo Gondi were not merely residences, but social stages, where power was expressed through control of space, rhythm, and ritual. But as Florence entered the following centuries, that stage began to lose its audience. Traditional rituals, once instrumental in binding the elite to the city, became increasingly ceremonial. Formal palace receptions, family gatherings, and patronage of the arts no longer held a central place in Florentine social life. The city increasingly prioritized efficiency, economic gain, and flexibility over symbolism and ritual. In this context, aristocratic identity was not directly attacked, but rather left behind. This created a clear generational rift within the long-established families. Older generations still believed in the value of continuity, in preserving the lifestyle that had shaped their families for generations. Meanwhile, younger generations, born in a changed Florence, began to feel that those values no longer offered a real social advantage. They did not abandon their families, but gradually distanced themselves from the public roles their clans had once held. During this period, Palazzo Gondi ceased to be a breeding ground for ambition, and became a space of nostalgia and preservation. Changes in religious life also contributed to the blurring of the aristocratic role. Florence was once a place where faith, politics, and society were closely intertwined. Noble families not only patronized the arts, but also deeply participated in religious organizations and community rituals. But as religious structures were gradually adapted to serve greater powers, the mediating role of the Florentine aristocracy diminished. They were no longer the indispensable bridge between the individual and the community, between faith and social life. Palazzo Gondi subtly reflects this shift. The interior spaces of the palace, once designed for reception, negotiation, and display of status, became increasingly private. They no longer open up the city, but close in to protect a shrinking world. This is not a tragic decline, but an orderly retreat, a defensive choice against a Florence that no longer needs its old symbols of power. Florence, at this point, is no longer the city of dynasties shaping the future through their enduring presence. It has become a space where memory and the present coexist, but no longer merge. The aristocratic palaces, including Palazzo Gondi, stand there as layers of historical sediment, a reminder of an order that once dominated, but has now lost its ability to reinvent itself. It is in this disconnect that the silent decline of the Florentine aristocracy becomes clearer than ever. They were not defeated by any specific enemy, but by a change in how society operates and values. Palazzo Gondi did not collapse, was not replaced, but it also ceased to play a central role. It exists as a testament not to failure, but to obsolescence. The next part of the story will expand this picture to the entire urban landscape of Florence, as the city learns to live with the symbols of the past and as the enduring existence of aristocratic palaces becomes part of the landscape, rather than part of living power. By the 17th century, Florence was no longer a city searching for its future. It had entered a different state, politically stable, but dynamically closed. Under the rule of the Grand Dukes, the city no longer lived in the constant tension of republicanism or family rivalry, but shifted to a steady, managed rhythm of existence, somewhat based on the memory of a glorious past rather than the desire for expansion. It was in this context that the decline of the Florentine aristocracy became clear, not through dramatic events, but through the disconnect between the city and the people who had shaped it. Florence continued to function, trade, build, and be maintained as a cultural center of Italy. But the role of the aristocracy in that life had fundamentally changed. They were no longer the driving force of innovation, but a parallel class to the city, existing within it, but no longer leading it. The long-established families, including the Gondi, did not disappear from Florence. They continued to live, own property, and maintain their names. What they lost was the ability to make the city react to their presence. This shift is evident in the urban landscape. Florence began to be reorganized according to new administrative and symbolic principles, linked to central power rather than to individual families. Streets, squares, and public buildings reflected a stable order, where individuals and families were no longer the center of the narrative. Within this structure, aristocratic palaces, like the Palazzo Gondi, became fixed points in a system that operated independently of them. The Palazzo Gondi, at this point, was no longer seen as a declaration of power, but as a landmark in time. Florentines passing by no longer associate it with the political or economic influence of the Gondi family, but with the city's history, a history that has closed in terms of power, yet remains present in form. The palace has not been significantly altered, demolished, or upgraded to conform to the new order. This immobility is what makes it unique. While the city continues to adapt, Palazzo Gondi seems to choose to stand still. For the Florentine aristocracy, standing still was not an immediate failure, but a survival strategy. They preserved what remained by not deeply intervening in a system they no longer controlled. But this strategy also meant excluding themselves from the process of shaping the future. With each generation, their social role narrowed, not because they were deprived, but because they were no longer needed. Florence, during this period, began to see itself as a city of heritage. Art, architecture, and history are cherished, but primarily as completed values, no longer being created with the same intensity as before. This creates a profound paradox for the aristocracy. They live in a city that celebrates the past, yet they themselves are a part of that past. Their presence is accepted, even respected, but no longer serves a guiding purpose. Palazzo Gondi becomes part of that paradox. It is both a residence, a historical symbol, and an object no longer participating in the process of social transformation. The rooms within the palace no longer witness decisions capable of changing the city, but preserve the habits, rituals, and memories of a class gradually withdrawing from public life. The palace is not dead, but neither is it alive in a political and social sense. It is the continuation of the city, parallel to the stagnation of the aristocracy, that creates Florence's characteristic form of decline. There was no revolution overthrowing the old class, no mass destruction of symbols of power. Instead, there was a long process in which the city learned to function without the people who had once been its center. Palazzo Gondi, through its quiet and enduring existence, became the clearest evidence of that process. The next part of the script will take the story deeper into the modern era, as Florence enters a larger world, where the role of traditional city-states fades, and when the existence of aristocratic palaces is redefined as part of collective memory, rather than living power. Entering the 18th century, Florence was no longer seen as a dynamic center of power, but as a space that had completed its historical role. The city still existed, was still governed, and still possessed the beauty that Europe admired, but the intrinsic dynamism that had shaped Florence during the Renaissance had receded. In this context, a subtle but decisive transformation took place. Living power was gradually replaced by preserved history. For the Florentine aristocracy, this was a time when decline was no longer a silent process, but a prolonged state. They no longer awaited the return of their former roles, nor harbored the illusion that the previous order could be restored. Instead, they learned to survive in a city that had begun to define itself through memory. The long-established families were no longer seen as political actors, but as guardians of tradition, a respected role, but one that lacked decisive weight. This shift is evident in Florence's treatment of architectural space. The aristocratic palaces, once symbols of active power, are gradually being seen as historical assets. Palazzo Gondi is no longer tied to expectations of influence or family ambition, but becomes part of the urban landscape to be preserved. Preservation is not aimed at maintaining the power of its owners, but at retaining the memory of a bygone order. This creates a profound reversal of roles. Previously, history served power families told their stories to consolidate their position. Now, power serves history. The city preserves the palaces, not because their owners still wield influence, but because they tell the story of Florence. The aristocracy, in the process, becomes a supporting character in the very story they once centered on. The Florence of the 18th century is also the Florence of new ideas. The Enlightenment spread throughout Europe, bringing with it concepts of rational governance, administrative order, and the public good. In this new order, the role of the individual and the family diminished in comparison to that of the state and the system. This further rendered the traditional aristocratic model obsolete. They were not attacked for privilege, but simply surpassed by a more efficient form of social organization. In this context, Palazzo Gondi became more symbolic than functional. It continued to be used, continued to be maintained, but was no longer a place of decision-making. The rooms once associated with power were now associated with memory, with stories told to future generations. The silence of the palace was not a sign of abandonment, but rather an expression of a completely changed role. For the city, this process unfolded relatively smoothly. Florence did not need to dismantle its past to enter the modern era. It integrates the past into the present, transforming heritage into an integral part of urban identity. But this very integration affirms the end of the aristocracy as a living force. They are preserved in architectural form and collective memory, but no longer in shaping the future. The decline of the Florentine aristocracy, therefore, does not resemble a personal tragedy or a collective collapse. It is more like a transition spanning generations. From creators of history, they become part of history. Palazzo Gondi does not tell the story of failure, but of transformation when power retreats in an orderly fashion, giving way to memory, preservation, and urban continuity. The next part of the script will continue to follow this process into the 19th century, as Florence enters the age of nationalism, and as aristocratic palaces face a new question: how to survive in a world where history is not only preserved, but also exploited and reinterpreted. The 19th century ushered Florence into a completely new era, not only politically but also in how people understood history and their role within it. The city no longer existed as a self-contained entity with its own trajectory, but was swept into the process of Italian nation-building. In this flow, Florence's old power structures, which had weakened centuries before, almost lost their place. But instead of disappearing, they were redefined in a different way, becoming tangible memories of a completed past. Florence during this period did not collapse or get replaced. On the contrary, it was rediscovered. As the Italian unification movement spread, the city was seen as a cultural and historical symbol, rather than a de facto center of power. This created a profound paradox for the Florentine aristocracy. They lived in a city celebrated for its past, but they themselves were no longer subjects of the present. The history they once created is now recounted by the state, scholars, and the public, no longer under the control of the clans. In this context, aristocratic palaces began a new life cycle. Palazzo Gondi was no longer seen as the residence of a powerful family, but as part of an urban heritage to be identified, preserved, and interpreted. The palace's existence was no longer tied to the social role of the Gondi clan, but to Florence's symbolic value within the larger narrative of Italy. Ownership may still belong to the family, but its significance has transcended the personal sphere. This shift profoundly affected how the aristocracy perceived themselves. Titles, lineage, and traditions that once held political significance now became more cultural than power-driven. Subsequent generations were no longer nurtured to govern or direct the city, but to preserve family honor in a society where the past was cherished, but no longer dictated the future. Family succession no longer equates to the succession of power. Florence, in its journey to becoming a heritage city, learns to coexist with layers of time. Streets, squares, and palaces are not erased to make way for radical modernization. Instead, they are preserved, rearranged within a new narrative, a narrative of national identity, art, and shared memory. In this narrative, the Florentine aristocracy emerges as historical figures, no longer as living agents. Palazzo Gondi clearly reflects this shift in roles. It is neither isolated nor completely frozen. The palace continues to exist within city life, but as a space of reference. People look to it to understand what Florence once was, not to speculate about its future. The power once tied to those stone walls is now replaced by its historical interpretive value. Remarkably, this process did not create a major conflict between the city and the nobility. There was no mass expropriation or revolutionary purge. The decline, once again, occurred in silence. The old families accepted their new roles slowly, sometimes reluctantly, but rarely with resistance. They became keepers of memory, no longer shapers of power. Florence, entering the nation-state era, did not need to dismantle the past to move forward. It carried the past with it, but in the form of heritage. And it was in this transition that the Florentine nobility completed their historical journey. From the center of power, they became part of the spiritual landscape, remembered, studied, but no longer participating in the decisive flow of the age. The next part of the script will take the story to the 20th century, when tourism, modernization, and the heritage economy transform Florence into a global city, and when aristocratic palaces like Palazzo Gondi must adapt to one final role, to exist as the intersection of history, commerce, and collective memory. Entering the 20th century, Florence faced a turning point unlike any previous century. For the first time in its history, the city began to live not only for itself, but for the world's gaze. Tourism, academia, conservation, and media transformed Florence into a global symbol of art and history. In the process, the relationship between the city and its past fundamentally changed. History was no longer merely preserved, it was presented, and consumed. For the Florentine aristocracy, this was the final stage of a long journey. They were no longer overtaken by new power or a different political order, but by an entirely new concept, the heritage economy. In this order, the value of the past lay not in its ability to dominate the present, but in its ability to attract, tell stories, and represent identity. The long-established families, if they still existed, were present only as part of the context, not as subjects. This transformation is evident in how the city treats its historical spaces. Palaces, churches, and squares are no longer seen primarily as places of residence for a particular class, but as stopping points in a story told to outsiders. Palazzo Gondi, in the 20th century, naturally stepped into that role. It didn't need to change its form to suit the new era. Its very integrity, its immutability, became its value. Florence now functions as a living city museum. This doesn't mean the city is dead or frozen. On the contrary, it lives very strongly, but lives in the constant tension between modern life and the responsibility of preservation. In that tension, the aristocratic palaces are no longer purely private spaces. They become public objects in the social consciousness, even though ownership remains individual. For families like the Gondi, this was a moment when control over meaning completely slipped from their hands. Their palace was seen, photographed, analyzed, and recounted by others. Family history, once a vibrant stream, became documentation. There was no longer direct conflict between the family and the city, but neither was there uniformity. The past was preserved, but no longer belonged to those who had lived within it. Florence, in the first half of the 20th century, learned to present itself. Tourist routes, ranked buildings, academic studies, and historical publications together created a standardized image of Florence, beautiful, profound, but also selective. In that image, the nobility appeared as historical figures who had completed their roles. They were not harshly judged, but neither were they placed back at the center of the story. Palazzo Gondi exists entirely within that logic. It doesn't need to be revived as a center of power, nor does it need to be transformed into a tragic symbol. Its existence, enduring and quiet, is enough to tell the story of an order that has ended. The stone walls no longer conceal political decisions or family ambitions. They become the surface on which history is read, contemplated, and consumed. Remarkably, in this process, Florence does not lose its identity. The city does not turn history into an empty shell, but integrates it into modern life. But this integration also means a definitive affirmation that the age of the aristocracy has ended. They are not erased from memory, but are fixed within it. The next part of the script will take the story to the final decades, when present-day Florence confronts its aristocratic heritage directly, and when Palazzo Gondi becomes an open question: what remains when power, role, and ambition have vanished, but the architecture remains immovable by time. By the latter half of the 20th century, Florence had entered a completely new state of historical existence. The city no longer needed to prove its role in European politics or economics, nor did it need to assert its heritage before the world. Florence was now implicitly a symbol. This implicit assumption created a profound paradox. When everyone believed Florence was understood, the most important questions about it were rarely asked. In this context, the Florentine aristocracy, if they were ever mentioned, existed primarily in academic studies, conservation records, and stories told with a nostalgic tone. They were no longer seen as the cause of social injustice, nor were they celebrated as the force that ushered in a new era. They became a neutral historical class, placed at a safe distance from time. Their decline, therefore, was no longer controversial. It was accepted as a foregone conclusion. It is in this accepted state that aristocratic palaces begin to take on a different meaning. Palazzo Gondi is no longer just a well-preserved structure. It becomes an open question about the relationship between power and time. The stone walls that once symbolized control, distinction, and social order now stand before a democratic, populist, and ever-changing city. This contrast doesn't create conflict, but rather a moment of quiet reflection. Late 20th century Florence doesn't dismantle aristocratic symbols, but neither does it allow them to dominate the city's spiritual space. They are placed in their proper positions, no longer at the center, but not pushed to the periphery either. Palaces like Palazzo Gondi exist in an intermediate state, both residences, monuments, and familiar urban settings, to the point that people sometimes no longer see them as special objects. That familiarity is the clearest sign that power has completely retreated. A symbol only truly loses its power when it no longer attracts attention. When Florentines walk past Palazzo Gondi without feeling pressure, awe, or social distance. It shows that the structure has completed its transformation. It no longer divides society. It merely marks space. For the noble families that still exist in name, this is a period of complete assimilation into modern society. They are no longer expected to represent anything different. Their names, if still mentioned, are more historical than social. Important city decisions no longer concern them, and conversely, they no longer need the city to assert their identity. Florence, in this period, becomes a city where the past is no longer a source of power, but a source of reflection. People don't come here to find answers about how society should be organized, but to question how society once functioned. In these questions, the Florentine aristocracy emerges as a case study not to judge, but to understand. Palazzo Gondi, with its continuous yet quiet existence, serves as a stopping point in that process of reflection. It doesn't force people to remember, nor does it try to tell its story loudly. It is present enough to evoke layers of overlapping time. And it is in this undemanding presence that the story of the quiet decline of the Florentine aristocracy reaches another depth, the depth of acceptance. The final part of the script will conclude this journey by returning to the present, not to draw a conclusion, but to pose the ultimate question: when power, ambition, and social order have vanished, what truly remains in structures like Palazzo Gondi? And why does their existence continue to hold significance for people today? When this story returns to the present, the first thing that emerges is not change, but continuity. Florence is still alive, still bustling, still admired, and still misunderstood as an immutable city. Tourists continue to arrive, cameras continue to point at the ancient stone facades, and the narrow streets still carry within them the rhythm of daily life. Amidst all this movement, Palazzo Gondi stands there not as a declaration, not as a noisy reminder, but as a quiet truth. Palazzo Gondi no longer needs to prove anything. It does not represent a rising dynasty, nor a tragically declining class. It represents a completed phase. The stone walls once erected to protect status, to create social distance, to define power, now serve only one purpose: to exist. And it is precisely this very existence without power, without social role, that becomes the most profound message this work carries. Florence today no longer operates on the basis of family, bloodline, or aristocratic rituals. The city is governed by modern mechanisms, by tourism, services, academia, and the lives of ordinary citizens. But what is noteworthy is that Florence does not erase its past to conform to the present. It retains structures like the Palazzo Gondi, not to glorify old power, but to remind us that power, however secure it once was, is only temporary. Within this space, the Florentine aristocracy completed their historical journey quietly. They did not disappear, but neither are they the center. Their names live on in archives, in research books, in historical annotations. What they leave behind is not a model to emulate, but a lesson to ponder. Power can be built with stone, with money, and with time, but no form of power can withstand the change of society. Palazzo Gondi thus becomes a silent answer to the question Florence has posed for centuries: what remains when ambition has retreated? The answer lies not in ruins, nor in lasting glory. It lies in the adaptation of memory. This structure no longer determines the city's future, but it helps people understand their past more deeply, and understand that every social order, however enduring, has an end. Florence, with all its beauty and allure, is no longer a city of ruling dynasties. It is a city of overlapping layers of time, where the past does not disappear but becomes transparent. One can live next to Palazzo Gondi without feeling weighed down by history. And that shows just how far Florence has come since the time these stone walls were erected. As the screen closes, there are no images of collapse, no dramatic ending. Only a structure remains standing in a city that still lives. And in that silence, the story of Palazzo Gondi and the quiet decline of the Florentine aristocracy completes itself not as a tragedy, but as a historical cycle that has come to a complete end. Florence doesn't need the old families to continue to exist. But Florence needs their traces to understand who it is. And Palazzo Gondi, through its prolonged silence, continues to do that every day, without words, without power. From the quiet vantage point of Palazzo Gondi in the present, this story does not end with a definitive conclusion, but with a slow breath. For history, when viewed sufficiently, rarely takes the form of clear straight lines. It is like the layers of stone at the foot of Florence, piled upon one another, bearing the weight of time, yet none completely disappearing. Palazzo Gondi stands there, not to recount the past in an imposing way, but to remind us that the past never left, it only changed its place in human life. If in the 15th century, this palace was an affirmation of order, and in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was a fortress of cautious retreat, today it exists as a meaningful void. A void where power once existed, once operated, then gradually retreated without collapsing. There are no statues of victory, marking the end of Florentine nobility. There was no moment when the city declared it had surpassed them. Everything unfolded in silence, and it is this silence that makes this story unique. Modern Florence no longer questions who ruled the city. That question has been answered in books, in museums, in history classes. What Florence inadvertently poses each day, as people live, walk, work, and love in the shadow of ancient buildings, is a much deeper question: what does power become when it loses its social function? Palazzo Gondi does not answer that question in words, but through its enduring existence. Here, there are no longer class divisions carved into stone. No longer the feeling that a wall can determine who you are in the social order. What remains are forms, materials, the traces of human hands that once believed they could freeze their position in architecture. But time has proven otherwise. Stones may endure, but the meaning embedded in them does not. It is always reinterpreted by subsequent generations. And it is in this reinterpretation that Florence finds its unique balance. The city neither attempts to erase the traces of old power, nor blindly worships it. It allows structures like the Palazzo Gondi to stand there, not as the center of the story, but as an open backdrop. Anyone can walk past, look at it, or even ignore it. This freedom is the clearest sign that power has completely departed. For the Florentine aristocracy, if they still exist in collective memory, they exist as evidence rather than a model. Their story is no longer told to praise or criticize, but to understand. Understand that power was once built not only by violence or law, but by patience, by social networks, by architecture, and by the belief that the present order is permanent. And also understand that this very belief is the most fragile thing. Palazzo Gondi, in its final role, does not teach people how to hold power. It teaches how to accept the retreat of power. Not through ruin, but through continuation. Not through tragedy, but through normalization. When a symbol becomes normal, it loses its ability to dominate the human imagination. And then, it becomes a benign part of life, instead of a tool for imposing order. Perhaps that is why Florence today can be both a living city and an open repository of memory. People can drink coffee, debate, fall in love, argue, and make a living alongside walls that once witnessed decisions that changed the city's fate. There is no contradiction here. There is only continuity. History is no longer a heavy burden on the present, but a quiet backdrop, enough for people to feel the depth of where they stand. As the camera leaves Palazzo Gondi, there is no dramatic sunset or pulsating background music. Only the light continues to shine on the stone, as it has for hundreds of years. And in that moment, the clearest thing is not focused on the past, but on the present. That every society will create its own symbols of power. And then, over time, those symbols will also undergo a similar journey from the center to the periphery, and then to memory. The story of Palazzo Gondi is not the story of a specific family, nor is it just the story of Florence. It is a slice of human history, where power does not disappear in a moment, but dissolves into everyday life. And it is in this undramatic disintegration that humanity learns an important lesson, that no social order is immutable, and no structure can retain its original meaning forever. As the film concludes, what resonates is not a powerful message, but a lingering feeling, a slow understanding that history doesn't need to end to have meaning. It just needs to be observed long enough, patiently enough, for people to recognize their place in its flow. Palazzo Gondi remains. Floor.